Gorgeous and fluid, 1988's Ninja Gaiden for the NES revolutionized video game narrative by paying tribute to film classics while sporting best in-class action design. This is the Annotated Ninja Gaiden. With the opening of Act 4, A Trap, we meet, spoilers, recurring franchise enemy, the Shadowy Foster, whose heel turn at the end of this game will beget our interactions with him in 1992's Ninja Gaiden 3, The Ancient Ship of Doom. That's a different game though. Here, Foster is the vessel in which exposition is delivered, starring in the longest cutscene in the game unless we combine both the ending cinematic and the credits, which we will. Regardless, we're getting ahead of ourselves. When we return to Dr. Smith, we find him in something of a bad way before being whisked off by other shadowy men. These guys take us to Foster, supposedly head of a special auxiliary unit of the US Central Intelligence Agency, but since Ryu himself questions his character more than once on his motives and methods, it sets up some nice foreshadowing for what happens at the end of the game. In truth, this setup is yet another common trope in film, that of a clandestine government agency recruiting an outsider for their own, sometimes nefarious purposes. This again recalls 1960s Alfred Hitchcock classic North by Northwest, mentioned at the beginning of Act 2, but this is such a pervasive old nugget of cinema that it's been around since near the dawn of the medium. Hitchcock himself even revisited this model time and again with films like The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1934 and The 39 Steps in 1935. And the idea of a common man being black-bagged by government hoods became such a perennial staple in movies and television that it became a parody in the age of irony, as nearly everything does. Viewed from a slightly different lens, Ryu here is going to be thrown into the northern Amazon rainforest, likely Peru, to recover a stolen religious artifact for bumbling government actors, which is basically the plot of the also previously mentioned Raiders of the Lost Ark, just tossed into a blender. But this story dumped from the bland government spook does a few things of note. First, it alters the course of the plot from revenge thriller to infiltration spy thriller. Ryu is by no means a common man in over his head as he would be in something like a conspiracy movie, but a capable killer that, as Foster likely knows, will find his father while also dealing with the greater threat. Second, we start to put a face to the name of that threat, the dreaded Guardia de Mu, also known as the Jakio. Notice the phrasing of this interaction. It implies that Guardia de Mu is this character's actual name, gibberish expression that translates from French into something like the keeper of better, but likely also a mistranslation of some other intended phrase. But Foster also says that he calls himself the Jakio. This is interesting because, again, this is a nonsense word to Western audiences whose spelling suggests that it has some meaning derived from a European Romance language, which, surprise, it doesn't. In truth, this was a bad localization of the Japanese title Jakio, which translates into Evil Demon King. The kanji in furigana in the Japanese manual clearly spells this out. All of this is important to the larger context of the game, but gets into the weeds a bit. What's important is that we're watching something of a grand narrative play out in front of us, something that was practically unheard of prior to Ninja Gaiden's release as far as a console or even just video games in general are concerned. Certainly, stories large and small were in video games prior to 1988. On the NES, Pac-In Video's Rambo and Capcom's Bionic Commando dealt in static talking heads to lay out the larger plot in 1987 and 1988, respectively. Point-and-click adventures and RPGs big and small dealt with their share of princess saving on PCs over both sides of the Pacific Ocean as well. Ninja Gaiden, though, took a different approach. The cutscenes, dubbed cinema displays by Tecmo for the game's release, strove to make the unfolding adventure actually cinematic, following the rules established by film like shot-reverse shot editing. The camera would occasionally move as well, giving the action on screen a sense of dynamism that video game stories had never seen. For a game that moved at a breakneck pace with fluid combat and challenging gameplay against ever larger bosses, the real set pieces of Ninja Gaiden were meant to emulate pieces of an actual set. All of this could be traced back to the father of this project, director Hideo Yoshizawa. Having originally planned to work in mass media like film and commercials, Yoshizawa saw what was happening with home video games and noticed that story wasn't the most important thing to players at the time. According to a 2009 interview with Nintendo Power, he says that he, quote, felt that if I put in cutscenes and made the story more involved, they might take notice. The cutscenes then were planned from the start to be an integral part of the Ninja Gaiden experience. Having come from helping other Capcom staff with the first Captain Tsubasa game's story, he felt that he had an opportunity to experiment with how narrative could work in the context of a Famicom game, but this was still a rudimentary process. In a roundtable interview for the Ninja Gaiden Definitive soundtrack, he mentions that he, quote, wanted to harness the capabilities of the Famicom to see if anyone could utilize cinematography and direction similar to movies. A student of the filmmaking process, Yoshizawa was interested in CinemaScope, a format for shooting and projecting film at roughly twice the width and height compared to the more common Academy format that we're used to seeing today. This was in vogue during the mid-1950s and into the late 1960s, but filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino will occasionally still employ it. This explains why most of the cutscenes are found with an ultra-wide letterboxed format, though this was also a method for saving and compressing data, as the story scenes themselves take up half of the ROM on the game's cartridge, and was challenging to compress. To do so, the team made eyes and mouths individual sprites that could animate, and used mostly bust and face shots of characters that could be easily panned up and down, saving on sprite and data size. This is all according to the Soundtrack Roundtable. All of this was carefully mapped out from the start. Working with artist and co-designer Masato Kato, Yoshizawa mentions in an interview on Heidi Kemp's Gaming Moe that the pair made copious planning documents carefully detailing the content and pacing of scenes. Before final implementation, these storyboards were passed to composer Keiji Yamagishi to accurately time musical cues, such as the quick sting after Irene shoots Ryu at the beginning of Act 2. Kato himself knew that they were onto something. In an interview with Hardcore Gaming 101, he says that he, quote, felt we were creating something that hasn't been done before. Yoshizawa also knew the importance of the text and dialogue experience and how that would translate to Western audiences. In a Gaming Moe interview, he said that he oversaw the localization of the game for English speakers himself, even hiring a translator and working with them on the script. While you may not excuse the numerous mistranslations that we found already and will see again before this series is over, I find it unfair to cast stones, as Japanese to English localization was still very much in its infancy. Even rare when we find that a Japanese creator was planning it during development, at this point in home video game history. But while dialogue and cutscenes are the largest facet of how Ninja Gaiden's saga plays out, story is peppered throughout the game if we pay attention to the pacing and the action. At this point, you've already seen static interspatial rooms with nothing in them but ladders leading to the next scrolling section of the level. These add both a sense of scope to the areas that Ryu finds himself in, as well as the occasional exhale between challenges that he has to tackle. Of course, there are also the well-placed minor cinematics that break up the action or give weight to some of the later fights, like the famous view of Jakio's Temple of Darkness, something also likely ripped off from the Castlevania games, and the 1979 anime classic Castle of Cagliostro, where Konami also likely took its inspiration. Since Yoshizawa is an avowed fan of that film's creator, revered animator Hayao Miyazaki, it's likely more of a nod to the latter. From the Gaming Moe interview, he always liked looking at storyboards from Miyazaki's films, and wanted to implement that sort of camera work and artistic design. Though he left the NES games in Kato's capable hands after the first entry, Yoshizawa did find opportunities to combine the characters with his interest in film, later as the director of the Ninja Ryukenden anime film, which can be found on YouTube. For Tecmo's part, they capitalized on their internal teams emphasizing both story and gameplay very quickly. Starting with the aforementioned Captain Tsubasa, the company began a short line of what they call Tecmo theater titles. In all, only 8 games bore this branding on their packaging, including the second Captain Tsubasa, Kyoto Ninden Taiyende, Radius Senki Renmei Hen, and all 3 Ninja Gaiden games, which were the only entries of this subseries that left Japan. Into the game then, we've come across one of the final power-ups that we have yet to discuss, the very handy 1-up, which is an illustration of our main character. These are very rare, and we only find 3 throughout the course of the adventure, though we'll find a helpful workaround in the next episode. While also containing the longest cutscene in the game, this is also the longest act that we've seen so far, having 3 levels and a boss fight instead of the previous 2. The rest of the game will follow suit. The second stage is listed in the manual as Basilisk Minefield, which is a lizard endemic to the South American Amazon that has a curious ability to run on water. Minefield implies that it would be a battlefield, with landmines sprinkled all over it, but that's not the case, as this is clearly more of a mineral mine with tracks on the ground and minecarts immobile throughout. This is some nice visual storytelling though, since we entered the Temple of Darkness through the mine. Since, according to Foster, the temple is more of a prison for the demon that the statues sealed away, this is a very Tolkien-esque part of the story, as the mines of Moria were also locked away for similar reasons. The third stage of this level is called the Hall of Demons, and is another challenging section for what it lacks, the jump and slash weapon. If Ryu wants to use it against the boss, he has to carry it from the mine all the way through this level without either dying or accidentally grabbing a different sub-weapon. Judicious use of it certainly makes Area 3 easier though. This will be a bit of a recurring motif over the next few episodes. If he's packing it for the boss though, he'll make the fight quick. If not, he'll have to contend with Helberos, one of the more interesting end-level sequences of the game. Mistranslation of Cerberus, the 3-headed watchdog of Hades from Greek myth, The Kelberos fight pits Ryu against 2 pet dogs of Jikio, according to the manual. Not one of the Malice 4 that the manual keeps referring to, this is evidently a dog given up for ritual sacrifice that returned as this sort of leaping creature. Only one, though, is the true enemy, as the monster that starts on the right can be killed without the boss fight ending. Funny enough, this is one of the only places where the windmill throwing star will go through a boss, as the lesser Kelbero can be killed in a single shot, giving the small arena much more breathing room. In the next episode, we'll finally find why this act was titled A Trap, and litigate Ninja Gaiden's legacy for challenging gameplay. See you then.